folks, it's 6:33 and we will get started for this evening. I would ask folks this, please make sure that your microphones are muted. I think we have everybody muted at this point, but hopefully we're there. My name is Pat Phillips and I'm delighted to present this evening's program. I'm honored to serve as the president of the board of the Green Mountain Audubon Society, a chapter of National Audubon that covers Vermont, covers Chittenden, Franklin, and Grand Isle counties. And if you get the Audubon magazine, by virtue of your area zip code, you are assigned to the Green Mountain Audubon chapter. And we really appreciate your membership to Green Mountain Audubon, and many of you have made donations to us in the past. And a lot of those donations we use to offer scholarships to students to support conservation projects in the area. And it really goes to a lot of good. So thank you for your membership. Thank you for your donations. And if you are interested in joining, I will paste in the chat this evening a link to our webpage so that you could possibly join. Green Mountain Audubon Society operates in a region that was part of the ancestral lands of the Western Abenaki. And we like to observe that they were the traditional caretakers of these lands and these waters. And we respect their connection to this region and remember the hardships that they continue to endure. We feel honored to play a role in caretaking the life and habitat of many of the organisms in this area. And we give thanks for the opportunity to share this place with each other. Well, tonight's guest this evening, I am really delighted to present. Many of you know Zac Cota from birding. And one of the things I can say about Zac is every so often you meet somebody in birding who is so enthusiastic about birding, but even more enthusiastic about sharing that bird, his knowledge of birds and sharing the experience and the wonder of birds with others. And Zac is really one of those individuals. And so we're lucky to have him tonight. Zac is somewhat of a self-described vagrant these days. Zac is deeply rooted in Vermont birding community and has a background in biology and education. He's worked or volunteered for numerous environmental and conservation organizations throughout the state. Zac's been long fascinated with the unusual and the unexpected, and he's able to maintain his connection to Vermont's birds as an eBird reviewer and a member of the Vermont Bird Records Committee, even while traversing the continent in his employment. So at this point, without further ado, I'd like to turn the program to Zac. And if you have questions during the course of the program, please type them in the chat and we will either take some breaks or get to them at the end of the program. So Zac, take it away.
Thank you so much, Pat. I'm really excited to join you and the rest of the Green Mountain Audubon Society again tonight. It's always a pleasure to present to you folks, to engage with some people who are very interested about birds and birding and share some exciting new stuff. Tonight, I'm going to be talking all about rare birds in Vermont. I'll tell you first a little bit about me. So like Pat said, I have a background in conservation. I worked throughout the state on different projects and as an educator. And now I work in healthcare. I'm a travel nurse, but I still get that connection to Vermont birds by participating as an eBird reviewer. So if you report a rare bird in Vermont, I might be one of the ones that is looking at that report, and as a member of the Vermont Bird Records Committee. But right now I get to travel all around for work and get to see birds across the country. It's really exciting. Tonight we're going to talk about rare birds, so give you some perspective on what makes a bird rare, some patterns of rare birds, how to find them, how to report once you've found them. We're going to talk about some historic records in Vermont and talk about kind of the ethics and future of twitching, which is a European term for chasing rare birds. So I'm going to go through, and first I want to thank all the folks that have made their images public and shareable on the iNaturalist webpage, which is where most of my photos come from. The photos that I'm using mostly when possible are from Vermont birders of rare birds that were seen in Vermont. Sometimes they're from elsewhere, but where possible, I've tried to use the actual birds that were seen in Vermont by Vermont birders. And I'll just kind of highlight some fun ones as we go through. This is a varied thrush. It's a Western thrush species related to a robin, but this beautiful kind of orange, black, and gray coloration. This is a winter visitor to Vermont that has occurred about 20 times throughout the state. And we haven't had one in a few years. There were a few years where we had like every other winter, varied thrush were occurring on winter bird counts, but it's been a little while since we've had one. So we're due for a winter varied thrush. So some perspective on rare birds. It takes a lot of knowledge to really understand what's happening. In order to really understand why these birds are ending up here, we have to know about their life history. So where they normally live, what their lives are like, not only for each individual species. So like we might have know that hummingbirds migrate differently than waterfowl, but even within hummingbirds, the migratory patterns of uh, ruby-throated hummingbirds are very different from rufous hummingbirds. This rufous hummingbird was seen in Vermont. It's a Western species that is known to come to the Northeast and the East pretty regularly. And often in the late fall. So I tell people to leave their hummingbird feeders up at least until Halloween, if not all the way till Thanksgiving, because most of the rufous hummingbird records in the Northeast occur in late October and even into early November. So if you're thinking about when to take your hummingbird feeder down, your ruby-throated hummingbirds might have left, but leaving that hummingbird feeder up an extra month or two might give you a chance to find a rare Western hummingbird. So knowing about life history is important. Knowing about the physics of flight and migration, so physically how birds actually make that migration, is really important. An understanding of geography, of habitat, weather and climate and how they affect migration, and also some history of birding, right? I one of my early birding mentors, Pat Folsom, who's joining us tonight, is always talking about the history of birding, which I think is something she got from Fred Pratt, right? Always talking about when we're going around Vermont, oh, there was this rare bird here 10 years ago, or this rare bird showed up here 5 years ago. Well, that knowledge is really important in putting together patterns of saying, okay, if a bird has happened once, now it happens twice. Is there a pattern emerging? Some species are rare because they have a really small population, or their population is really limited to a specific geographic area or a specific habitat. We're often discussing rarity on like a county level or a state level or even a national level, but birds don't really respect borders, so they can migrate and show up anywhere. Very few of the birds that we have in Vermont regularly, so like our breeding birds, the birds we see every year, are truly rare on a global level. But there are some that are declining fairly rapidly, and I'll talk about those in a moment. This is a painted bunting. This is a southeastern bunting species, somewhat related to our indigo bunting, that shows up with some regularity in the Northeast, usually in the spring, early spring or late fall. This one was, I think, down in Pittsfield, Vermont, in someone's backyard. So those birds that we have in Vermont that are declining are listed by the IUCN, which evaluates on a global scale how bird populations are doing. And they come up with these ranks that go all the way from least concern, those birds that really aren't threatened with extinction on a global level, all the way down through critically endangered and even extinct in the wild. So we don't have any of those globally critically endangered birds, but we do have some that are vulnerable. Long-tailed duck, cerulean warbler have been declining. Bicknell's thrush is a kind of an important species for Vermont because we're right in the core of Bicknell's thrush range. And so that bird is really, going to go extinct in Vermont if it goes extinct globally. And another one that we might not realize that's passing through our area annually that is declining rapidly is the rusty blackbird. We often see this bird in spring and fall migrating to its northern boreal breeding habitat, and it's declined by more than 90% in recent decades. So this is a bird that's pretty rapidly declining. So another way to talk about like perspective on what makes a bird rare, the American Birding Association, which covers the United States and Canada, has developed a code system for rarities from code 1 all the way to code 6. So code 1 are regularly occurring birds. These are birds that you can find just about anywhere in most seasons throughout the ABA area. So things like American goldfinch and mallard, pretty common stuff. Code 2 are birds that are regular but have a restricted range. So like Bicknell's thrush, it's regularly occurring in the ABA area, but you have to go to high mountain peaks in the Northeast in order to find it. Or they're widespread birds, but that are at very low densities, or they're pretty secretive and hard to find. So an example of that would be like a long-eared owl. They're found throughout North America, but they're pretty hard to find. A code 3 bird is a bird that's rare. It's annual in the ABA area, meaning it shows up every year somewhere in the US and Canada, but in very low numbers. So an example would be like a pink-footed goose. I think was just one in Vermont like last week. And they've now become annual in New England. And actually, there'll be, a number of them every spring in New England, and they're almost annual or every other year in Vermont now. That's a European species of goose. And then fork-tailed flycatcher, that's a South American, Central American flycatcher species, very distinctive with that long forked tail. They show up in small numbers, usually somewhere in the southern US every year. Both of these species have been recorded in Vermont. Like I said, pink-footed goose is, every couple of years in Vermont. Fork-tailed flycatcher, I think it's been more than a decade or two since there's been one, but there have been fork-tailed, I think 2 records of fork-tailed flycatcher in Vermont. So code 4 is casual. So these are birds that are not annual. They don't happen every year in the North America and north of Mexico, but there are 6 or more total records, including 3 or more in the last 30 years. So that kind of shows there is some pattern to them showing up here. So an example would be like gargany. Gargany is a duck from Europe. It doesn't show up here every year, but every once in a while, a gargany will show up somewhere in North America. There was one about 10 years ago that showed up in the Intervale in Burlington. So in the spring, someone was out birding. There was a flock of mallards in this little puddle, and there was a gargany mixed in with them. There is a little egret on the right. That's another bird that doesn't show up annually, but somewhat regularly. It's very similar. It's kind of the European version of the snowy egret that we have here in North America, except you can see on the back of that bird, it has 2 long white plumes that come off the back of its head. And that's pretty distinctive for little egret. This one was seen along the White River, just hanging out with some other egrets. And then code 5 are accidental birds. These are birds that have been recorded 5 or fewer times in the US and Canada, and fewer than 3 records in the past 30 years. So on the left there, we have a great black hawk, and on the right is a missile thrush. These were the great black hawk is a Central and South American raptor. The missile thrush is related to American robin. You can see it looks something like a young robin. That's a European species. These were both first records in North America. The missile thrush was a few years ago up in Quebec, and I know a bunch of Vermont birders made the trip up there to see this first North American record. The great black hawk is an even more incredible story. So it's a Central American bird that usually doesn't make huge migrations like other raptors might. And so there was some thought that maybe it would occur at some point in the southern US. So hawk watchers in Arizona and Texas had been on the lookout for this bird to kind of show up. And there was one year, I think maybe 8 years ago, this bird showed up, a juvenile bird showed up on a hawk watch in Texas on the coast. They watched it fly over. Very exciting moment to see this bird, first ever north of the border. People were very excited. It was in April, and that was that. They watched it fly north. And then in August, a person in Maine, on the coast of Maine, just south of Portland, noticed this very weird looking hawk in their backyard, took some photos of it, put it on Facebook, and a birder saw it and said, that looks like a juvenile great black hawk. And so for a couple days, this great black hawk was seen patrolling this neighborhood south of Portland. People took photos of it, and based on the molt pattern, birders were able to say that it was almost certainly the same bird that had flown over Texas in April. So April in Texas, same bird shows up in August in just south of Portland, Maine. Birders watch it for a few days and then see it drift off and fly out to the ocean, just flies off into the Atlantic Ocean. And people think, well, that's it. It's doomed. It isn't seen for like a month later. And then in this park in downtown Portland, someone else finds, here's the great black hawk. And birders were able to watch it for a couple of months as it terrorized the local squirrels in this park. And it's a bit of a sad ending for this like Central American bird that just was not adapted to make it through a harsh northern winter. One day, folks went out to find it and found it standing on the ground, brought it to a rehabber, and unfortunately, it had pretty severe frostbite on its legs and had to be euthanized. But the body of the bird was then taxidermized and given to the Maine State Museum, so you can go see the actual great black hawk that was the first ever in North America. And there's also a very lovely statue of the bird in Deering Oaks Park, so you can go see the statue where the bird was last found in Maine, and then go see the actual bird itself. The last are Code 6 birds. So these are birds that used to live in the ABA area but are now extinct. So both of these birds likely occurred in Vermont in the past. Passenger pigeon, Vermont was probably within its breeding range. And Eskimo curlew, which went extinct only in the middle of the last century, likely migrated through Vermont every year. So we also have our own way of keeping track of rare birds here in Vermont. So since 1980, the Vermont Bird Records Committee has maintained the official bird list for Vermont. So a list of every single bird that has ever occurred in Vermont, and also all of the birds that have nested here in Vermont. So annually, the committee reviews rare species reports, rare nesting reports, and reports of birds that are, quote, out of season. So those that are either returning early or migrating late. And then every year we publish a report of all the rare birds that were seen the previous year. There have been 397 species of birds documented in the state of Vermont. Over 200 of those have nested in Vermont, right? So, but that still leaves a huge chunk of birds that don't regularly occur here. So we have birds that nest here that are found here every year. There are some more that winter here that don't nest here but come here from the north in the winter. But then there's this huge subset of birds that we don't think of as really living here in Vermont, that have occurred here maybe once or twice or a handful of times. Generally, the committee will review species until we've had about 10 to 20 reports of that bird, and then we consider that it might not be a vagrant anymore. It might be coming here regularly. And then we'll leave it up to, say, the local eBird reviewers to review records of those, instead of requesting that people report them directly to the committee. So how does the committee work? Well, you find a rarity, and if you find a rare bird, or you find a bird that you're not sure what it is, but you suspect it could be a rare bird, the first thing to do is kind of pause and try and document what you're observing. So if you can, take some photos. If it's making noise, take an audio recording. If you can, start taking notes immediately. We really, when we're looking at reports of rare birds, it's really important for us to know, did that person take notes immediately? So in real time while they're seeing the bird, did they take those notes afterwards, maybe a day later when they're trying to remember what happened? Or did they take those notes a couple days later after they went and looked at all their different field guides and read online? Very different things, whether you're writing notes days later after you've looked at field guides versus taking them in that moment. Or another thing to do is just, if you have a smartphone with you, you can start an audio recording. So start describing in an audio recording what you're seeing in real time. Possible, call someone else. If you have a birder friend around, say, hey, I think I've got a really rare bird here. Can you come look at this too? That way there's two of us that will make a report. That's another thing the committee looks at, is having multiple observers on the same bird. And then when you're done observing the bird, reporting it via eBird, and that'll go through a review process. Every county has an eBird reviewer that will look at reports of rare birds. And then if it meets the criteria, we'll ask you to complete a rare species form on the Vermont Bird Records Committee website. And you can go on the website and see there's some helpful tips about how to report rare birds. And there's also the official Vermont Bird Checklist. So if you're curious at the end of this presentation about just what are these 397 birds that have been seen in Vermont, which birds have nested here, what are the expected date ranges for migratory birds in Vermont, this checklist has all of that information for you. So something for you to look at if you're wanting to learn more about just what species we're talking about today. And then, of course, it has that actual form for you to fill out if and when you do find a rare bird. This kind of process has really evolved over the last 50 years of birding, right? Back 70 years ago, they used to have Vermont Daily Field Cards, which was just a little note card where you filled out what birds you saw in your house or in your neighborhood on a certain day, and you mailed that back to the Vermont Institute of Natural Sciences, and they cataloged those. And if there was something rare, they put it out in an annual report. So really important data, but not exactly a real-time rare bird alert, right? Moving a little bit forward, there was a rare bird alert phone hotline where if someone saw a rare bird, they would phone it into this hotline, and then birders could actually call the hotline number and hear a recitation of all the rare birds that had been seen recently. And then the listserv, so there's an email listserv here in Vermont called VT Bird, where you can exchange information about birds and birding, but also about rare birds with other Vermont birders. And then eBird alerts now, so a lot of people are using eBird to report things, and that can give you almost hourly updates of rare birds in your area. There's also Facebook groups for Vermont birding and the American Birding Association. And now there's even apps like Slack and WhatsApp that allow birders to have real-time engagement with rare bird chases. And I've been to some rare bird chases where, there's a local WhatsApp group, and, people are sharing minute by minute, the bird flew over here, the bird flew over there, and you're watching this whole group of birders just redirect in real time as the bird is moving. And here's what the Vermont Rare Bird Alert looks like. So if you're not subscribed yet on eBird, you can see it's a pretty minute-to-minute list of what rare or unusual birds are showing up in Vermont.
Zach, we have one question. Is eBird linked to iNaturalist?
They're two different platforms, so they're not linked. They do very similar things. So you can report birds on both. One nice thing about iNaturalist is if you have a picture of something and you're not sure what it is, you can post it on iNaturalist and other people will help you identify it. And that has actually found some rare birds. Similarly, the American Birding Association has a What's This Bird Facebook group. So you can, if you're not sure what a bird is, you can post a picture and say, I saw this bird at this location on this date. And birders from all over the continent will say, oh yeah, that's a this. And it's actually been responsible for finding some really rare birds. I think Arkansas just had its first ever yellow grosbeak record. And I think that was a What's This Bird finding. Someone saw a rare bird, a bird they didn't recognize in their backyard, took a photo, put it on this Facebook page, and other birders were like, that is the first ever yellow grosbeak in Arkansas. So iNaturalist and eBird, different tools, work a little bit differently, but both great resources. So I want to put some perspective before we get into talking about how rare birds happen on like birds in Vermont. So 100,000 years ago, what species were in Vermont? Well, there were no birds. Vermont was covered with an ice sheet a mile thick. So no birds here at all. 10,000 years ago, the ice is melting, but it's still a very like post-glacial tundra environment. So probably not a high diversity. Maybe some like grouse species, maybe like common raven might have existed here, but not a tremendous amount of bird diversity. 1,000 years ago, so we're talking about like a pre-colonization forest. Vermont is almost entirely covered in forests. So things like warblers and tanagers and orioles, they're really having their heyday then. But it also was a time where a lot of the species further south of us had not made it this far north, and probably northern species had a bigger footprint. So things like boreal chickadee might have had, and Canada jay might have had an even greater range in Vermont. 100 years ago, we're talking about almost no forest, right? Vermont was close to its forest minimum, covered in fields. So this is when birds like American kestrel and savanna sparrow and eastern bluebird that were not previously widespread in Vermont were coming into the state. And even 10 years ago, the birds look different. So every year, almost every year, we're adding new species to the Vermont list. So we have new vagrant birds coming in. We have new species breeding in Vermont. So our Vermont bird list is really a dynamic and changing record. So here's another perspective on rare birds. Like, raise your hand if you have this species in your neighborhood in June. So I'm guessing almost everyone here has robins in their backyard in June. Okay. How many people have this species in their neighborhood in January, right? Probably fewer, but if you're in northern Vermont, you might say, oh, robins, they come back in April. But if you go out to, say, Lake Champlain in the wintertime, you might be able to find flocks of American robins eating things like juniper and sumac, right? So it really depends on where you are and what time of year, or what birds you might find. Here's a little bit more perspective. As recently, let's go back 50 years, right? As recently as 1975, these birds were pretty uncommon in Vermont. I mean, here's the first breeding bird atlas. Tufted titmouse were hard to find in most of the state, versus the second breeding bird atlas 25 years later. They're fairly widespread and really dense. I think of like a place like Shelburne Bay as a pretty notable birding hotspot in the Champlain Valley. Any one of these species might have been unusual at Shelburne Bay 50 or 60 or 70 years ago. And now it wouldn't be unusual to have all 5 of these, sometimes in big numbers, on the same day at Shelburne Bay. So our bird populations are changing, sometimes pretty rapidly. So I want to move into talking about the processes that happen to bring rare birds here. So there's two main processes. The first is vagrancy. Vagrancy is really when birds aren't trying to come to Vermont, but end up misdirected. And then the other is eruption. So eruption occurs when birds are moving intentionally. Often they're trying to search for food. And these are going to get broken down into even smaller processes. So it's really important. People, when a rare bird shows up, a vagrant shows up, people are often concerned and sometimes confused about how a bird, say from Europe or Asia, would end up here. But it's helpful to keep in mind that vagrancy is a really natural process. It's how species establish new breeding populations. It's how they find new wintering grounds. It's how species ensure there's gene flow between different isolated populations. And it's not just seen in birds. There's vagrancy in insects, in fish, in reptiles. A famous case of mammalian vagrancy is a mountain lion that had been collared in South Dakota in the Black Hills and ended up being hit by a car in Connecticut, right? That is a example of a vagrant. It's a pretty natural ecological process. Here's a great example of a species in Europe. This is Rich's pipit, and their historical breeding ground was in kind of northeastern Asia, wintering in southeastern Asia, but they kept finding these birds popping up in the winter in Western Europe. And that pattern kind of increased until the point where it wasn't just one or two birds showing up occasionally. They developed an entirely new wintering ground. And this may be really important as birds adapt to climate change, to have these vagrants that are finding new places to live and exist as other territories change and become uninhabitable. So which birds become vagrants? Not all birds are prone to vagrancy, right? A big thing is adaptation for migration. So birds that regularly undergo long distance migrations are more likely to be thrown off that migration path. Birds with a large body size, birds with really big wings, big and powerful wings, are more likely to show up in weird places. It's also more likely birds that migrate earlier in the spring and later in the fall are more likely to encounter inclement weather that blows them off course. And then, of course, just the more there are of a species, the larger the global population, the more chance there is that one individual gets thrown out of place. Now, we often talk about vagrancy, and it's most exciting when we're seeing birds that have crossed oceans or crossed continents. But vagrancy doesn't have to happen on that huge of a scale. So let's think about a relatively sedentary species like the spruce grouse, right? So we have spruce grouse up in the northeast corner of Vermont. There's a small breeding population. There's also a breeding population in the White Mountains and over in the Adirondacks, and of course, further north in the boreal forests of Quebec. Now, they're really a habitat specialist. They like dense spruce bogs, and they don't often stray outside of that habitat. Well, there is a big push in birds that have territories, so territorial birds, for the young birds to leave their natal territory where they were born and seek out a new territory. Now, I want to consider you're a young spruce grouse, your territory is kind of on the edge of the boreal forest. You have this instinct to go find new territory and you fly away, but instead of flying into equally suitable territory, you fly out of your boreal forest and suddenly you're in territory that is unfamiliar and unsuitable to you. You may well just keep going until you get to another patch of suitable habitat. So that edge effect, birds at the edge of their range, combined with that drive to dispersal, may explain why a spruce grouse was seen last summer on the side of Camel's Hump, right? Miles and miles and miles away from what is suitable habitat for it. And also, not a bird that is migratory, right? These birds stick to their little bog. So really unexpected to find a bird, to find a spruce grouse on the side of Camel's Hump, but also fascinating to think that, there was this video taken on the side of Camel's Hump in 2023 of a spruce grouse. There are also two historical reports, both from biologists, so pretty credible, from the 1970s, seeing spruce grass on Camel's Hump. So it begs the question, where did these birds come from? Are these young birds that are dispersing? Which population are they from? They're pretty much equidistant from the White Mountains, from the NEK, and from the Adirondack populations. But then also just thinking, is this how a species like spruce grouse that is going to be negatively affected by climate change is going to find habitats that are suitable and manage to eke out a living as the climate changes? One big thing in finding vagrant birds is something called detection bias. So I want to case study here two different birds, right? They're both flycatchers. They're about the same size. The western wood peewees found throughout most of the western U.S. and Canada, and it has a huge population. There's just tons of western wood peewees, but there's very few records of vagrants in the east. Versus scissortail flycatcher, it has a much smaller, compact range. There's fewer of them globally, but it has this huge pattern of vagrancy. There are hundreds of records of scissortail flycatcher showing all over coast to coast, records including in Vermont, all over the Northeast. So these two pretty comparable species in the same family, about the same size, why is one vagrating and one isn't? And it really has to do with detection bias. So up top, that's what the western wood peewee looks like. It's kind of this unassuming gray-brown bird. And it looks very similar to a couple species we have here in the east. So our eastern wood peewee or our olive-sided flycatcher. So it's possible that these birds are indeed showing up in the east, but in the fall, they're in the forest, so they're sticking to high vegetation. So A, you might not even see the bird, and B, if you see the bird, you might pass it off as an eastern wood peewee or an olive-sided flycatcher or even an eastern phoebe if you don't get a great look at it, right? Versus the bird on the bottom, the scissor-tailed flycatcher, right? It is an absolutely stunning bird. It has this kind of peachy colored underbelly and this huge, long, forked tail, almost like a barn swallow, right? It is almost unmistakable. Even if you're not a birder and you saw this bird, you would say, whoa, that's something I've never seen before. That's unexpected and not supposed to be here, right? So that starts to piece together why there is such a difference in these two species. If a scissor-tail flycatcher ends up far out of its range in the fall, it's probably going to get detected. They also have a habit of sitting out in the open on perches and hawking insects on the wing, and they're often found in kind of open environments with sparse vegetation. So the combination of just like the look of this bird and its behavior mean that it's more likely to be detected if it is a vagrant. Western wood peewee is probably a ghost vagrant, right? It does have vagrancy into the east, particularly in the fall, but they probably get missed. And then there are some that, despite controlling for all other factors, the species just seems to wander, right? So ash-throated flycatcher, it's another flycatcher similar to the last two we talked about, similar in size. There are tons of them that show up in the east and particularly in the northeast. This is a southwestern bird, right? You see it kind of in the scrublands of the southwest, and yet there will be dozens of them throughout the northeast in the winter. Even comparing it to other similarly sized birds, and this trend has even increased. It seems like there are more and more ash-throated flycatcher vagrants, and it'll be interesting to try and figure out why is this? Why is it that this bird seems to want to go to the northeast in the winter, and why is this pattern increasing as well? So what causes these birds to show up in unexpected places? Well, there's extrinsic factors, so external factors, like the weather, that can cause them to go weird places, but there's also internal or intrinsic factors. So things like a genetic alteration that can cause them to end up someplace different. And then there are factors that kind of combine both. And we're going to talk about each of these factors individually. So disorientation is one. Birds often use either topographic or stars to navigate, or magnetic clues to orient themselves in their normal migration. And when those cues aren't available, they can come disoriented, right? So birds often migrate when there's a clear sky, so they can use the stars to navigate. If it's persistently cloudy and they're forced to migrate when there isn't a clear sky, they might get disoriented, right? Really fascinating thing is solar activity, right? So birds use the geomagnetic poles to orient themselves during their migration. And so peaks in solar activity has been shown to disrupt that geomagnetic disturbance, and there are higher rates of vagrancy across many different families of birds when there is increased solar activity. So if you're a birder and you want to dive into finding rare birds, like, you'll start tracking solar activity and pair that with migration and go looking for rare birds. Another thing that's happening is the poles are actually shifting, right? Our north and south pole are constantly shifting. They've been shifting about like 15 kilometers a year toward Russia, but lately that's been speeding up. And actually, the poles are now moving like 55 kilometers a year towards Siberia. Well, for a bird that navigates pretty precisely based on geomagnetic orientation, that change could be pretty significant. Now, one of the biggest factors in vagrancy is drift. So drift is when there's alterations in weather, so barometric pressure, wind, and storms, right? Those can move birds off their normal track. This is the most important factor when talking about cross Atlantic vagrancy, so vagrants from Europe coming to North America. And there's two major routes. There's a northern and southern cross Atlantic route. So it's important to just take a moment and look at what the normal pattern is. So a lot of birds that might nest in Europe spend the winter either in South Asia or in Africa, right? And then follow these kind of couple different routes up to Northern Europe, where they might cross and nest in Iceland, and go even further into Greenland to nest as well. Well, the North Atlantic route involves northbound migrants. So it's springtime. They're migrating back from their wintering grounds further south and up into the British Isles, further on to Iceland, and further on to Greenland to nest. Those birds might be caught in a storm, and then that storm might blow them off their track. And if it blows them further south and across the Atlantic Ocean, they often end up in places like Newfoundland. Newfoundland is a pretty famous migrant trap. So in the springtime, say March and April, they see a lot of European species that end up in Newfoundland because they're caught in a storm and brought across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, some of these birds might redirect and might make it all the way back to Europe. Some of them may just try and eke out a living in Newfoundland, and others end up going even further south and ending up in places like Vermont.
Zach, I
Now,
have one question that came
sure.
up. How much do nighttime lights from humans affect migration, and does it affect vagrancy?
Yeah, that's a huge one. It certainly affects local vagrancy in terms of like places like New York City, huge metro areas. It's going to kind of have them change direction. But yeah, it is lights from buildings, especially in big metro areas, are really detrimental to bird migration. And especially in areas like the Eastern Seaboard, where it is just like lights all the way up the coast. It's pretty tough for birds. Any other questions there, Pat?
No, that was it right now. Thanks, Zach.
So the southern drift route involves southbound migration. So birds that are heading toward their wintering grounds in Africa will actually get blown by storms across the mid-Atlantic to South America. And from there, they will then do their next northbound migration, but instead of being on the right side of the Pacific or the right side of the Atlantic, they're on the left side of the Atlantic. So they end up going up through the Caribbean and up the coast of North America, where they'll show up in Vermont. And so this is a common route for things like a little egret, which is that European egret species. This is possibly how that one showed up in central Vermont. It's common for white-winged tern, for ruff, which is a sandpiper species, for garganey, which is that European duck that I showed earlier. So this is that other South Atlantic route. And then the last big route from Europe is in the winter, when they get these pretty intense storms that blow out of Eastern Europe toward the west. It often involves very cold temperatures and a lot of snow. So ground feeding birds like thrushes, like sandpipers, they're kind of forced toward the coast where there's better feeding because there's more moderate temperatures, but they also get entrained in this wind. And so some of them will try and make it to the coast, but then they'll get pushed even further and end up getting blown all the way across the North Atlantic Ocean. And so this is where we get things like that missile thrush that was in Quebec in December. That was probably from a storm like this, blowing it all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. The other thing that happens more locally from drift are just weather patterns like the jet stream, right? So birds that are already misoriented, that are maybe Western birds that are flying east, get caught in the jet stream and it just carries them along and pushes them east. So it's really easy for Western birds to migrate east. And then we've had some pretty significant storms. So a couple of years ago, there was a bomb cyclone in the middle of winter, a nor'easter. It had wind gusts up to 70 miles per hour, and it pushed a lot of these little seabirds that are related to puffins called dovekie. It pushed them sometimes hundreds of miles inland. And there were dozens of records in inland Maine and New Hampshire, including this bird that was nicknamed Wonder, that was found on a road in Westmore, Vermont. Now, a lot of these birds were driven to a rehab because they need to be in water to really survive. And this bird was found just on a road. It got pushed in the wind and set down on a roadway. And so people brought it to a rehabber. And one single rehab center in Maine took care of dozens of dovekies, many that were released successfully, but unfortunately, Wonder was not one of those that recovered. Now, the biggest storms that we have that move birds around are hurricanes, right? Not all hurricanes are created equal, though. So birds are pretty adept at avoiding smaller, slower moving storms. But really fast storms that have strong winds can really push birds or entrain them, pull them behind them. And there's the particular counterclockwise winds that a hurricane have in the northeast quadrant of the hurricane really drag birds from out in the Atlantic Ocean, brings them inland on its leading edge. And so depending on where this hurricane where hurricanes make landfall in the Northeast, they can dump dozens of seabirds, even hundreds of miles inland. Now, the one other factor in hurricanes is rain. And we found that heavy rains in a hurricane, particularly heavy rains, lead to a higher degree of bird mortality. And so there's a long history of storm-blown birds, of hurricanes and tropical storms dumping seabirds that are usually hundreds of miles out in the Atlantic Ocean into Vermont, right? So things like storm petrels have been dropped by hurricanes in Vermont for over 100 years. Now, there's one particular storm that is responsible for a number of first state records. This was the great 1938 New England hurricane. So it made landfall in late September in Long Island. So it was kind of perfectly positioned where that that leading northeast edge of the hurricane was bringing birds from the ocean inland. And then huge wind gusts, 186 miles an hour, and it had a forward speed of 60 miles an hour. So it was moving north at 60 miles an hour, which is one of the fastest hurricanes ever measured. So unlike slow moving hurricanes where birds can avoid it, birds didn't have time to get out of the way. So they got just sucked into this hurricane. And there are crazy records, things like 3 white-tailed tropic birds found throughout Vermont, Corey's shearwater, great shearwater, 4 different leeches, storm petrels found in various parts of the state. So, hurricanes and tropical storms, it's something to pay attention to, because as the occurrence of these in New England increases, it's likely that we'll see more of these storm-blown birds post hurricanes in Vermont. So another vagrancy pattern is misorientation. Now, most long-distance migrants are born with an internal compass and clock, right? It says when you're ready to migrate, you're going to go this direction and you're going to go for this long. But either one of those mechanisms may be faulty in a young bird. And on the bottom left, you can kind of see there's 2 patterns that this comes in. Mirror migration, where it goes kind of the opposite direction on an angle, often like a 90-degree angle, or reverse migration, where it goes about 180 degrees in the wrong direction. But often they go the right distance, right? They go for the right amount of space. They are just going in the wrong direction. On the right here is a western kingbird that showed up in Vermont, and this is probably a misorientation bird. It showed up in the spring, and it should have gone west, and instead it went east.
Zach, this is a good point for one question that John's asking.
Sure.
Are we seeing any evidence for hybridization among some vagrants and local species?
Yeah, there is some evidence of that. I mentioned that little egret earlier, that European cousin of our snowy egret. Well, there's been evidence of enough little egrets showing up in North America and staying in North America and kind of just living their life as a snowy egret, that they've actually bred with snowy egrets, and now there are like intermediate hybrid little snowy egrets, and that's been documented in other species that end up out of their range as well. So that's definitely happened, and it will be interesting to try and find more of those birds as there's more mixing between continents. So misorientation often has that mirrored pattern. We're seeing the mirrored pattern more in the springtime when young birds are making their first northbound migration, right? So birds that would migrate from Central America to the west end up migrating from Central America to the east. And so this is often a spring phenomenon. And the opposite is true in the fall, right? Where western birds that should be migrating south end up migrating northeast as well. And so this is where we often get western birds showing up in Vermont in the fall. And even we get southeastern species in the fall. So these are often young birds making their first migration. So something like a painted bunting that is in the southeast that is meant to migrate further south for the winter ends up going 180 degrees and winds up in New England. This is also a mechanism for birds in Europe to end up in the Northeast in the fall. So birds nesting in Greenland that should migrate to Central Europe make a mirrored migration and end up in the Northeast instead. And so we talked about the earlier drift factor with migration bringing birds in the spring to from Europe to Vermont. This is a mechanism for bringing things like waterfowl and shorebirds to the Northeast in Vermont in the fall. So we've got two different mechanisms bringing European waterfowl here, one in the spring and one in the fall. Another pattern of vagrancy is dispersal. So this is common among particular colony or group nesting birds, and it's a mechanism evolved to ensure gene flow between different populations and to help establish new colonies. So in the late summer, after birds fledge, they have an instinct to kind of wander and find a new place to establish, and that's where they'll return the following spring to make their nest. And so we see this often. Birds that are just meant to wander around a little bit end up wandering pretty far north of their more southerly habitat. And we get things like herons, ibises, ducks, gulls will do this. It's also seen slightly less commonly in things like rails. Might be responsible for things like king or clapper rail showing up in Vermont in the late summer. And also doves will kind of make big movements like this as well. Association is not necessarily its own vagrancy pattern, but it often is a result of birds being out of place and needing to complete, their migratory instinct. So something like a common ringed plover that was seen a couple of years ago up in Missisquoi Bay. This is a European plover species. It probably was either disoriented or drifted down into, over into North America. And then when it looked around and couldn't find any common ringed plovers to complete its migration with, it found some semi-palmated plovers, which are regularly occurring here, and just joined them and just started living life as a semi-palmated plover. And so this is a pretty common thing with waterfowl and with shorebirds. And then we have overshoot. Overshoot is often a spring occurrence. At least here, it happens in the fall as well, but that's headed in the other direction, so we don't see it that much. But in the springtime, birds returning from southerly wintering ranges will go to their breeding range, and some might overshoot that. So there might be a strong tailwind that just carries them over, or I was talking about that internal compass and clock. The compass might be right, but the clock might be off. So it just might not tell them to stop. And this is probably responsible. There's a couple records of like anhinga in Vermont in the early spring when they're normally moving north. And that's probably the case with these birds. They just overshot the mark in their northbound migration. Many of these birds are able to redirect and turn around and go south, so they're not in Vermont long, but some of them will just hang out and even be in a more like northerly place outside of their range for months. Now, we can also see vagrants as vanguards of pretty significant changes. So one is like a lesser blackback gull. They used to be super rare in North America, anywhere in North America, to see a lesser blackback gull. But their Greenland breeding population has just exploded. And with that increase in that population has been an increase in vagrancy. And now if you look at records of lesser blackback gull along the coast, I mean, there are dozens of them. I was in North Carolina on a beach and I was like, that's a lesser, and they're just like everywhere now. And so what was once a vagrant is now really a vanguard of an increasing population. I think there was a lesser blackback gull like somewhere in Vermont a couple weeks ago.
Zach, this might be a good point. Anjanette came up with a question that says, do bird families exhibit conservation of vagrancy patterns? And if so, has a genetic sequence appeared enriched in the differing vagrancy patterns observed?
Yeah, there has been some effort to do some genetic studies and so see like, are these vagrant individuals, is there like an allele changed? Is there something that's causing them to to drift more than normal individuals of their species. Um, and sometimes it's just that, first migration, they get it wrong, and then they're, maybe in the future they are able to stay with their, conspecifics and get it right. But there are like crazy examples of, like, there's a tropic bird that lives in Maine, right? The next closest tropic bird is like south of Florida or out in the Bahamas or something like that. But this bird somehow migrated to Maine one summer and set up shop on an island, and it has come back year after year after year. There's no other tropic birds around, and it would be fascinating to to get DNA and compare it to other tropic birds and say, okay, what's going on with this bird? But often we're just trying to look at patterns and see, are there patterns emerging? Um, but I do think there will be more genetic analysis in the future that sheds light on some of these patterns.
Great,
Um,
thanks.
and then talking about, vagrants as vanguards, all four of these birds would have been considered vagrants in Vermont not too long ago. Hooded warbler is now nesting in Vermont. Dick Sissel on the bottom right, thanks to some really diligent effort by Ali Wagner, we were able to confirm a breeding pair in Vermont a couple of years ago. Acadian flycatcher breeds just west and just south of Vermont. There have been more Acadian flycatchers showing up during the breeding time. White-eyed vireo is another one that is south of us, expanding its range, and they're showing up here more and more. So these birds may not really be vagrants. They might be the leading edge of expanding populations. And that's true also of some birds that are recovering, right? So things like trumpeter swan that we almost hunted to extinction in North America and globally, as they've been reintroduced in the Great Lakes area and in New York, we've seen more and more trumpeter swans in Vermont and likely breeding somewhere in the state as well. Similar sandhill cranes, as they've recovered as well, they're starting to reoccupy their historic range, which includes Vermont. So these might have been vagrant birds or rare birds in the past, but they're just recovering. The other mechanism besides true vagrancy is eruption. So eruption occurs when we get a kind of a southward influx of birds that are further north, and usually this has to do with food supply, right? So sometimes in a cyclical pattern, so related to things like red-backed voles, which a lot of northern owls eat, or related to the cone crop up north, which often occurs in cyclical intervals. So we'll see it with winter finches. We'll see this with boreal chickadees. We'll even see it with willow ptarmigan, which is like a grouse species that lives way far north. Will sometimes wander south in really hard winters. And then right now, what we're having a boreal owl eruption. So if you look at, into the across the Northeast and into the Great Lakes, dozens and dozens of boreal owls moving south. Unfortunately, a lot of these birds are really in poor condition. So birds that normally are pretty nocturnal, hunting in broad daylight. And there has been a pretty high degree of mortality, unfortunately, as well. But this is the other factor that, besides true vagrancy, that regularly brings rare birds into Vermont. And then there can be eruptions of birds that are just looking for different resources, right? So one thing that will happen, American three-toed woodpeckers often travel to areas where there's recently been a burn. They're kind of burn specialists. So they'll come into an area that's been burned, where there's plentiful resources, right? So we might get micro eruptions of this bird that's not commonly seen in an area, but there's a fire, and now there are three-toed woodpeckers. Similarly, crossbill species will wander pretty widely in search of cones, and if they find a cone crop, they'll settle down and start nesting any time of the year. And so that's another way we can get like eruptions of unusual birds. So, what's the best time for finding rare birds in Vermont? And where is the best place? Well, there are some patterns that we can see, and I'll break those down. But really, it can happen anywhere at any time. So spring and fall migration are really prime time for those vagrant birds. Thinking the end of the summer, we're getting some southern birds dispersing north. And then wintertime is prime time for those northern eruptions coming down. And really, the people who find rare birds are often the ones that are out there looking specifically for them, know the patterns really well, know what to look for, and also the people that are most acquainted with the expected species. So that way they are able to say, hold on, that's not a bird that should be here. Sometimes it's just luck though. But we have seen, like I was mentioning earlier, with that yellow grosbeak in Arkansas showing up at that bird feeder, increases in backyard bird feeding, more photography, more social media has increased our detection of rare birds. And then there's, things like Cornell Lab of Ornithology creating like bird casts are able to model migrations, combine them with weather forecasts to predict bird migration, but that can also help us predict when we might see unusual things showing up. And then new technology like MODIS, tagging birds and tracking birds might show some patterns in where vagrancy is occurring and why. So I want to briefly touch on some Vermont rarities that you guys can see back home in Vermont this year. Go out looking for them, and then I'm going to make a couple predictions before we wrap up. So early spring right now, this is prime time for Eurasian waterfowl. So you've seen already pictures of pink-footed goose, but also that barnacle goose on the right is another European goose, greater white-fronted goose. They all show this kind of bimodal distribution with late fall records that could be related to mirror migration on birds headed south. And then spring records, which could be related to like returning birds migrating north that get drifted across the Atlantic. So they have this kind of spring, fall bimodal distribution. And you're looking for these geese just in flocks of Canada geese. So go out, find a big group of Canada geese, look one by one until you find the goose that's different. Same thing with the vagrant European waterfowl that we get. So things like Eurasian widgeon, Eurasian green-winged teal, and garganey, they also have this bimodal distribution. So go out looking for them in late fall. But also right now is a really good time to find some of these European waterfowl. Eurasian green-winged teal, the photo on the bottom left, those two birds in the front are both green-winged teal. The one with the vertical stripe is our common American teal, and the one with the horizontal white stripe is the Eurasian version. So go out and look for that horizontal stripe. That's a European bird. Subtle difference, but if you know it, you can spot it. Later in the spring, we're going to get into those migration overshoots. So when our songbirds start to return to Vermont, you're going to go looking everywhere you look at hotspots for, regularly occurring migrants, but keep these birds in mind. Things like that Acadian flycatcher, summer tanager, all these southeastern birds that, that should be stopping in the Carolinas and Virginia. Look for them to keep going a little bit further and show up in Vermont. Later summer, we're getting into those dispersing birds. So birds that bred either further on the coast or further south, they're going to kind of move around and try and find new territory. So things like swallow-tailed kite, rails, wood stork often shows up in the Northeast in late summer, ibises, herons, those are your kind of late summer dispersers. And in the fall, we're getting a lot of southern birds making reverse migrations and western birds making mirror migrations. There is a whole list of western birds that have been seen in Vermont, some of them numerous times. So really fun birds. In late fall, you think, oh, migration's drying up, all my warblers are gone. Keep looking, because these birds often show up just a little bit later in the season than we're expecting. And then those winter eruptives, right? Things like boreal chickadee will show up in hard winters far south. I went and looked for one in Massachusetts that had showed up pretty far south of what we consider its current range. even things like willow ptarmigan here that will show up pretty far south in certain winters. And then there are just random birds, right? You never know what's going to show up. There were a couple people canoeing or kayaking on Shelburne Pond, took a picture of this tiny, weird bird floating around. They thought it was a duck, posted it online. It was Vermont's first ever ancient murrelet, which is a seabird of the Pacific Ocean, right? Out here in Washington, there are ancient murrelets, in the Pacific Ocean. One of them showed up on Shelburne Pond, right? There have now been 2 Mexican violet ears, these Central American hummingbirds that have shown up in Vermont. Mav Kim found a band-tailed pigeon at her bird feeder, right? This Western pigeon species randomly at a bird feeder in Vermont, right? So there are some patterns, birds we can predict, but then you never know what's going to happen. All right, I'm going to make some predictions here. So a little drum roll. The first Vermont record will be Chuck Will's Widow. I'm calling it now. Chuck Will's Widow. Okay, this is a close relative of our eastern whippoorwill, right? It's been recorded in all around Vermont. They've nested in Massachusetts. In Maine, there is a nesting group of Chuck Will's Widow, like 30 miles from Vermont in Glens Falls, New York, right? Yeah. It is the closest nesting bird that has never been seen in Vermont, right? So by all means, there should be a Vermont record of this bird. The problem is it's really difficult to detect. It's very cryptic. It's nocturnal. So the best place where it's likely to show up, I think, is probably southwestern Rutland County, like Danby and Paulet. But who's going birding in Paulet at midnight in May, right? Go do it. You could be the first to find Chuck Will's Widow in Vermont. So, okay, probably not a great guess because it's really hard to find. So I'm going to make another guess. Okay, a drum roll again. Drum roll. Vermont's next record will be Townsend's warbler. Okay, this is another bird. It's been seen all over around Vermont. It's a western warbler species, looks very similar to our black-throated green warbler. It's even been seen just over the river in New Hampshire. It also has this huge pattern of fall birds showing up in the Northeast. Back in 2019, there was an incredible fallout event of Townsend's warblers all over the East Coast. In St. John's, Newfoundland, they had 20 individual Townsend's warblers in Newfoundland, right? And we still don't have a record of this bird in Vermont. One problem is it's a small bird. It looks very similar to our black-throated green warbler. Here's the key. It often shows up a little bit later than black-throated green warbler, when they've already left. So here's what I want you to think. If you see a black-throated green warbler and it's after October 15th, I want you to take a second look at that bird. If it's real dark like this, get a photo of it. You could have the Vermont record Townsend's warbler. But again, probably not a great guess because it's small, it's hard to find, and it's similar to another species. So, okay, sorry, I'm going to make another guess. Okay, another drum roll. And Vermont's next record will be Limpkin. Okay, now this is actually a really good guess. Limpkin is a wading bird. It's a southeastern species, and it has been rapidly expanding north. In the past 10 years, there are like a dozen states throughout the country that have added their first ever limpkin. It's big, it's highly mobile, really easy to detect, and hard to misidentify. So I think this is a really good one. If, about this time of year, I want you to start looking for overshoots. And then again, in late summer, we can start thinking about dispersing birds. But limpkin, I think, is a highly likely next first Vermont record. So get out there this spring and look for limpkin. Just to be safe, I'm going to make one more guess. Mississippi kite, right? This is another one that should be pretty easy to spot. It's a big, distinct bird. This is another southeastern bird that's been rapidly expanding its range. It even has nested for the past 10 years in southern New Hampshire, right? So it's in southern New Hampshire, migrating south. There've got to be Mississippi kites at least coming through Vermont, and I think in the future will likely be nesting in Vermont. The other thing Mississippi kite has going for it, there are plenty of hawk watchers in southern Vermont. So I'm sure there are people on Putney Mountain that have this bird on their brain, or at least should, as a future first Vermont record. So those are my guesses. Go out, find a limpkin, find a Mississippi kite. You'll end up in the record books. I want to move just this last little part and talk about just the future of birding and a little bit of ethics. So just keep in mind, 10 years from now, we could be having I could give this talk again and have a very different suite of birds to discuss. Birds are moving north with climate change really quickly. Vagrancy is changing. There's more vagrancy with climate change. As there's more solar activity, as the poles move, as there are worse and increasingly frequent storm systems, there will be more vagrant birds. The other factor, more people are birding. There's a lot of people out there with smartphones, with eBird, that are finding stuff. So I think it's likely the next 10 years are going to have new breeding birds like this prothonotary warbler, and lots new birds added to Vermont's list. Now, a couple of things I just need to touch on. They're not as fun, but twitching or chasing rare birds does have some ethical considerations, right? So rare birds tend to draw a crowd. Crowds of birders impact communities. Some people love it. There was a study in Maine after the great black hawk and after the stellar sea eagle that was in Maine, showing that birders really contributed to the local economy. But poor birder behavior can also make things really uncomfortable for neighbors and communities, to the point where people have tried to shoo away or even harm rare birds because of the crowds of birders coming to see them. So suppressing rare bird reports out of consideration for those individuals may be a way to protect birds, but it can also be viewed as gatekeeping. So saying, okay, I'm not going to let everyone know about this rare bird because I don't want anything bad to happen to it, but I'm going to call my couple of friends to come see it, right? So you can see where the wider birding community could view that as sort of gatekeeping a rare bird. And then the other thing is, like, birding's really consumptive, right? Especially chasing rare birds, right? You are just dumping carbon into the atmosphere in order to check a box off a list. And I've done that. I am like so guilty of this. A couple years ago, I became the youngest person to hit 300 species in Vermont in their lifetime. And it was super exciting. I could think back on all 300 of those birds, but in order to do that, I drove hundreds and hundreds of miles. And I'm left with great experiences and a list of birds, but I think we need to think about more about the consumptive impacts of birding, and think that just like rare birds can be found anywhere. So if you thinking about like doing a big year, instead of doing a state big year where you're going to see as many birds as you can in Vermont in one year, think about doing a county big year. Or this trend happened about 10 years ago. It was a lot of fun for me. I did a 5-mile radius big year where I drew a 5-mile circle around my house. And I said, okay, I'm going to focus on birding places that are close to me, and places that I can bike to or take public transportation to. And it was a lot of fun to focus my birding effort more closely. And I did find some really exciting, rare things. Or even explore some new aspects. So looking more closely at subspecies, or learning nocturnal flight calls to find rare birds that way, or even just carpool to rarities can be a way to lessen the impacts of rare bird chasing. On that note, I want to just share a couple of books that were helpful to me in putting this together. And if you want to learn more, Rare Birds of North America is sort of like the encyclopedia of all the rarest birds that have been seen on this continent. Vagrancy in Birds talks at great length about the patterns that I was describing. And then two books by Scott Weidensaul really tell a more narrative story of bird migration. Living on the Wind is phenomenal, and his newer book, A World on the Wing, is really good as well. And with that, thank you all so much for joining me, and I'm glad to stick around for questions as well.
Well, thank you, Zach. That was an outstanding presentation. And it's interesting that you recommended several books, because Karen has asked us, have you written a book on it? Because it would make a great topic.
I don't think I'm going to write a book. I think Kent McFarland had on the Vermont Bird Records page had like an annotated list of rare birds of Vermont. And I think I'm going to resurrect that and try and like put some more of these really fun rare bird stories out there.
Yeah. Well, you're getting great reviews from folks. I'm sure I speak for everybody when we were thrilled with this outstanding presentation. And we miss you here in Vermont, but we're glad you're tied to us with the rare birds. And it would be a delight to see you back here again sometime. And so thank you very much for this presentation, and thank you for everybody to attending.
Thank you so much, Pat, and thanks Green Mountain Audubon for hosting me again, and everyone who attended. And if I'm happy to take questions now if anyone has any lingering questions, or feel free to pass them along through Green Mountain Audubon if you have any lingering questions after this.
Great. Yeah, I haven't had any more questions at this point. I think just lots of thanks and lots of laudatory comments to your presentation. It really was outstanding. So thank you so much for all the energy and time you took to do this, and hope to see you again soon. So with that, I'm going to say goodnight, everybody, and good night, Zach. And although it's not that late out, and Zach's in Spokane, right? Spokane, right?
Yeah, I'm out in Washington, so now I've still got a few more daylight hours of birding left.
Well, we won't hold you up then. Okay. You take care. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Good night now.